Have you ever wondered what it feels like to witness something so extraordinary? It makes you question everything you thought you knew. That's exactly what happened one icy morning at a quiet shooting range just outside Coastal Harbor, Maine, a place where hunters usually came to sight their rifles and hobbyists spent slow weekends practicing shots. The range was still waking up, fog hugging the tree line as the sun tried to break through the cold, damp air. But by the time the first shots rang out, everyone knew this was no ordinary day. She arrived alone, driving an unremarkable gray sedan that blended perfectly into the rows of old pickups. A woman in her mid-30s, wearing faded jeans, a nondescript gray jacket, and a baseball cap pulled low enough to shadow her eyes. Nothing about her screamed attention. She signed in with a name that made no impression: Alexandra Hayes. Frank, the range safety officer with 22 years in the Navy behind him, barely gave her a second glance. At first. Then he noticed the rifle case she carried. It wasn't the kind you found at local sporting goods stores. It was military grade, scuffed from hard use, but meticulously maintained. She set up at the farthest lane, where the crosswinds made accurate shooting nearly impossible, and began assembling her weapon with practiced, almost ritualistic precision. It was like watching a concert pianist warm up for a performance only they could hear. When she fired her first shot, it wasn't just a hit. It was a perfect bullseye on a target most couldn't even see with binoculars. The sound of the gunshot cut through the morning quiet like a thunderclap, and every head on the range snapped toward her lane. A second shot, then a third, each finding its mark at staggering distances. Conversations faded, coffee cups were set down mid-sip, and Frank's heart began to pound as he realized what he was seeing. Because Hayes wasn't adjusting for the wind with meters or apps. She was feeling it, closing her eyes between shots, listening to the rustling trees, then opening them with the calm certainty of someone who'd done this in places far more dangerous than a sleepy Maine town. Her breathing was the dead giveaway. A 4-count inhale, slow hold, and a smooth, unhurried exhale. Textbook advanced sniper technique. Frank's instincts screamed at him. He'd seen elite shooters before, but never anything like this. And as he watched her work, the hairs on the back of his neck rose. Because there are only two kinds of people who shoot like that: those sent to protect, and those sent to kill. And in that moment, no one at Coastal Harbor shooting range knew which side Alexandra Hayes was on. Frank could barely keep his hands steady as he lowered the binoculars. His mind flashed back to places far from Maine. Dusty airstrips, secretive forward operating bases, cold nights listening for distant gunfire. The way Alexandra Hayes moved, breathed, and shot reminded him of only one type of person, someone who'd spent a lifetime training for the moments most of the world never knew existed. And that thought terrified him more than he cared to admit. Other shooters began whispering, their nervous curiosity carrying down the line of firing lanes like a wave. A couple of weekend warriors started packing up their gear, wanting no part of the unsettling display unfolding in lane 40. One man tried to strike up casual conversation with Hayes about her rifle, but she didn't so much as glance in his direction. She was laser-focused, as if every muscle in her body existed only to aim, breathe, and squeeze the trigger. Frank stepped out of the safety office, his breath clouding in the cold morning air. He caught sight of Ted Swanson, the part-time range officer, with an old sheriff's badge tucked away in his wallet. Ted's face was pale, his eyes locked on Hayes. "You see what she's doing?" Ted muttered. "That's not hunting practice, Frank. That's a damn sniper course." Frank nodded grimly. Together they approached her firing lane. Hayes sensed them before they even spoke, lowering her rifle and rising to meet their gaze with eyes that were unsettlingly calm. Frank cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we need to see your ID and weapon permit." She held his stare, unflinching. "I don't have them with me," she said, her voice low but clear enough to carry. Ted's hand moved reflexively toward his radio. Frank hesitated. Something in Hayes's eyes told him she wasn't surprised by this. It was almost like she'd been expecting it. "Ma'am," Ted pressed, "you need to come with us until we can sort this out." There was a moment of silence so heavy, it felt like the whole range held its breath. Then, with a slight nod, Hayes placed her rifle carefully on the shooting bench, stepped back, and raised her hands. There was no fear, no anger, just resignation, as if this arrest was a minor inconvenience. As Frank and Ted escorted her toward the parking lot, the fog was finally lifting, revealing the distant outlines of Coastal Harbor's docks. Hayes glanced briefly in that direction, her expression unreadable. Frank noticed how her eyes lingered on the ships barely visible on the horizon. Something about that look chilled him to the core. Sheriff's deputies arrived minutes later, lights flashing across the damp ground. They handcuffed Hayes without resistance. Her face remained blank, but her eyes kept moving, scanning tree lines, buildings, power lines. Like a soldier, mapping every threat, every exit. As they guided her into the back of a cruiser, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't watching a criminal being taken away. He was watching a professional retreating into silence, and that meant something bigger was already in motion. Something that would soon sweep past the quiet lives of everyone in Coastal Harbor. Morning broke over Coastal Harbor with a sharp, icy breeze rattling the courthouse windows. By 9 a.m., the small, wood-paneled courtroom, usually empty except for traffic tickets and petty disputes, was packed with curious locals and reporters who'd caught whispers about a mysterious arrest. Rumors of espionage and terrorism swirled outside the building as a pair of deputies led Commander Hayes, still unrecognized by her true rank, into the room, wrists cuffed in front of her orange jumpsuit. Detective Wells sat in the front row, eyes locked on her as she moved with a grace that seemed completely at odds with her chains. She scanned the room once, quick, precise, efficient, just like she had back at the sheriff's office. The public defender assigned to her looked frazzled and overwhelmed. "Your Honor," he began, voice cracking with nerves, "I must request a continuance. My client has refused to cooperate, and I haven't been able to prepare a defense." Judge Eleanor Harmon, a former JAG officer who rarely betrayed emotion, frowned as she flipped through the file in front of her. Her irritation was interrupted by a sudden commotion at the back of the courtroom. The heavy oak doors swung open with a resounding boom, silencing every murmur in an instant. A Navy Admiral, immaculate in full-dress uniform, strode confidently down the center aisle, his presence like a thunderstorm in human form. Rows of military veterans in the gallery stood at attention without thinking. Even the bailiffs straightened their backs. 2 officers in navy whites flanked him, scanning the crowd with eyes trained for threats. Detective Wells felt his pulse spike. This was not the entrance of someone here for a routine bail hearing. The Admiral's medals caught the weak winter light as he approached the bench. Without a word, he handed a sealed envelope to the bailiff, who carried it reverently to Judge Harmon. The entire room held its collective breath as she broke the wax seal, unfolded the papers, and read. Her face shifted from annoyance to confusion, then settled on a grave, almost reverent understanding. Finally, she looked up, her voice steady but softer than before. "In light of the documentation presented by the Department of Defense, all charges against the defendant are hereby dismissed, effective immediately. This case is reclassified as a matter of national security." The crack of her gavel echoed like a gunshot through the silent courtroom. Gasps and murmurs erupted. Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching furiously. The Admiral stepped to Commander Hayes's side, nodding to the bailiff, who moved quickly to unlock her cuffs. For the first time since her arrest, Hayes spoke aloud, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience." The Admiral's response was immediate, his voice firm but respectful. "On the contrary, Commander, the Navy apologizes to you." Detective Wells felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. "Commander." "Not suspect, not criminal. Commander Hayes." In that instant, her entire demeanor shifted. Gone was the quiet, unremarkable woman he had arrested. In her place stood a military officer of unmistakable bearing, shoulders squared, eyes unwavering. The room's energy flipped from suspicion to awe. As veterans throughout the gallery saluted her, even Judge Harmon offered a respectful nod. The truth had changed everything, and as reporters swarmed the courthouse steps outside, Wells realized this story was far from over. The morning air outside the Coastal Harbor Courthouse was electric with confusion and whispers. Reporters surrounded the grand stone steps, shouting questions that no one would answer. Commander Hayes, now in fresh civilian clothes handed to her by Navy aides, stood beside Admiral Wilson, near a sleek black SUV bearing government plates. Cameras clicked furiously, but the Navy officers closed ranks around her, shielding her from the press. Sheriff Daniels, his badge glinting under the pale sunlight, approached with a tense mix of respect and frustration. "Admiral," he began, voice tight, "my department deserves an explanation. We treated this like a potential terrorist threat. She refused to ID herself, and we had no idea who we were dealing with." Admiral Wilson offered a solemn nod. "I understand your concern, Sheriff. Commander Hayes was operating under classified orders vital to national security. Her discretion wasn't just necessary, it was critical. You did your job, and did it well." Detective Wells stepped up beside the sheriff, still trying to process how close he'd come to derailing an operation he knew nothing about. He met Hayes' gaze directly. "Commander, I owe you an apology," he stammered. "I thought you were dangerous." Her eyes softened a fraction as she looked at him. "No apology necessary, Detective. You followed your duty with integrity. That's exactly what people like me count on." Just then, an elderly man in a battered Marine Corps cap approached hesitantly, leaning heavily on a cane. "Ma'am," he rasped, "I was a corpsman back in Desert Storm. Sat through that whole circus in there. I knew there was something familiar about how you carried yourself." He extended a weathered hand. "Thank you for your service." Commander Hayes clasped his hand firmly, her voice quiet but sincere. "Thank you for yours, Sergeant." Nearby, the Admiral's phone buzzed with an urgent message. He checked the screen, his face tightening. "Commander Hayes," he said firmly, "we need to move. Washington is waiting on your debrief regarding Operation Silent Harbor." Sheriff Daniels' eyes widened. "Silent Harbor? That was the name of the operation that stopped the port attacks last year," he said, voice hushed. The Admiral only gave a tight, non-committal smile. "That's classified, Sheriff. But know this. Commander Hayes prevented something none of us ever want to see." As the Navy team began shepherding Hayes toward the waiting SUV, the deputies who had once arrested her now formed an impromptu honor corridor, standing straight with hats in hand. The military veterans present snapped to attention, saluting as she passed. Even reporters fell momentarily silent, cameras hanging uselessly at their sides as they felt the gravity of the moment. Detective Wells watched, realizing with a sudden clarity why he'd felt something was off the day he'd handcuffed her. She wasn't hiding guilt. She was hiding excellence. She had done what few could, maintained absolute cover, even at the cost of her own freedom, to complete a mission most would never know existed. As the SUV pulled away, its tinted windows reflecting the pale coastal sun, Wells made a quiet vow. If there was ever another moment like this, he'd be ready. not just to enforce the law, but to protect the people who protect them all. The drive down to the naval station. Norfolk was quiet, the hum of the government SUV filling the space between Commander Hayes and Admiral Wilson. The convoy cut through early afternoon traffic with a silent urgency, blue lights on escort vehicles clearing intersections. Hayes sat straight in her seat, hands clasped in her lap, eyes focused out the window, though Admiral Wilson knew she wasn't watching the scenery. She was replaying every detail of Operation Silent Harbor, preparing for the debrief. When they arrived, security was intense. Multiple ID checks, uniformed Marines at every gate, and unmarked cars watching every angle. The black SUV stopped beside an unassuming building on the edge of the sprawling base. Inside, a small auditorium held fewer than 50 people, a gathering of senior officers and a handful of civilians with high-level clearance. Detective Wells had been invited at Hayes's personal request. He stood near the back, feeling out of place among the brass, but determined to understand the woman he had once mistaken for a threat. Admiral Wilson stepped to the podium. His voice was calm, but carried a weight that filled the room. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to recognize Commander Alexandra Hayes for extraordinary service during Operation Silent Harbor. He paused, scanning the audience before locking eyes with Hayes. For nearly a year, Commander Hayes operated undercover along the eastern seaboard, embedding herself within a network planning coordinated attacks on multiple U.S. ports. Gasps rippled through the room. Wells felt a cold sweat form at the base of his neck. He'd been completely unaware how close his community had come to disaster. The Admiral continued. Her intelligence work identified 16 individuals tied to foreign terrorist cells. Her actions directly prevented catastrophic loss of life and economic destabilization. Commander Hayes stepped forward. Her navy dress uniform looked crisp, but the lines around her eyes spoke of months spent in shadows. As she accepted the commendation, there was no smile of triumph, only a quiet nod, a recognition of duty fulfilled. Admiral Wilson's voice grew somber. When her cover was at risk of exposure, Commander Hayes maintained operational security, even enduring detention by local authorities without compromising her mission. Wells shifted uncomfortably. The memory of cuffing her burned in his mind. But as Hayes glanced his way, she gave a subtle nod. No resentment, only respect for a man who had done his job. After the ceremony, Wells approached her hesitantly. "Commander Hayes," he began, voice low, "I don't think I'll ever forget the day we met." She studied him for a moment, then extended her hand. "Neither will I, Detective, and I'm grateful you treated me with professionalism, even when you didn't know who I was." He swallowed, curiosity winning out. "Why didn't you just show ID or call in the cavalry before the arrest?" She glanced around, then leaned in. "Because the operation wasn't complete. Our targets had eyes and ears everywhere, police stations, government offices, even the courthouse. If I broke cover too soon, months of work could have been lost. Lives could have been lost." The words hung in the air between them. Wells realized how close he had come to unknowingly unraveling a mission that had saved countless lives. Admiral Wilson appeared at his side, hand on his shoulder. "You showed remarkable diligence, Detective. We could use someone like you." Wells looked back at Hayes, who simply nodded. It was an invitation without words, an entry into a world few civilians ever glimpsed, where quiet sacrifices kept the nation safe. Months passed after the ceremony at Naval Station Norfolk, but Detective Wells, now Special Agent Wells, found himself thinking often about Commander Hayes and that surreal courtroom morning. He'd accepted the Admiral's offer, joining NCIS as a liaison between local law enforcement and naval special operations along the eastern seaboard. His new role was more than a career change. It was a complete shift in how he saw the world. Now he knew firsthand how shadows moved beneath the surface of everyday life. He started by creating a comprehensive protocol for local police departments to recognize when they might unknowingly encounter undercover operators. His presentation used the coastal harbor incident as a case study, stripped of classified details, but enough to illustrate how easily duty-bound officers could clash with vital missions if lines of communication weren't open. The training spread quickly, adopted in departments from Maine to Florida. Each time Wells stepped in front of a group of uniformed officers, he thought of Commander Hayes, her calm, her commitment, her willingness to endure arrest to protect her mission. Meanwhile, back at the shooting range in Coastal Harbor, Frank kept a watchful eye on the lanes. Though everything looked normal, a dad teaching his son, a few retirees plinking steel targets, Frank had developed an instinct for recognizing shooters who didn't fit. Once in a while, someone would show up with exceptional discipline, subtle control of breath, perfectly timed trigger pulls, and a quiet intensity that reminded him of Hayes. When he saw it, he'd pick up the phone and make a discreet call using the number Hayes had given him. One day, Frank spotted a young woman with eyes that flicked constantly across the terrain, as if mapping every angle. Her shots were impossibly consistent, even in gusty winds. When he asked if she'd served, she gave a shy smile and claimed she'd just watched a lot of YouTube videos. Frank recognized the cover story immediately. That evening he called the special contact line. "It's Frank. I think I found another one," he said simply. The voice on the other end thanked him and ended the call without ceremony. A week later, Agent Wells arrived at the range with a small team. They met with Frank in his cluttered office, going over camera footage and registration logs. Frank handed over a security drive containing every shot the young woman had fired, time-stamped and organized. "You're doing important work, Frank," Wells said as he pocketed the drive. "You're not just running a shooting range anymore." Frank chuckled, eyes crinkling at the corners. "I figured that out when Commander Hayes walked through my gate." Late that night, as Wells drove away under a blanket of stars, he felt a deep sense of purpose. The training he'd developed, the connections he'd forged, and the trust he'd earned from those operating in the shadows. It all meant fewer misunderstandings, safer communities, and a stronger shield for those risking everything in silence. It was work that wouldn't make headlines, but it mattered more than almost anything he'd ever done. 3 months later, the storm had rolled in hard over Coastal Harbor. Sheets of rain lashed the empty shooting range as Frank worked late, wiping down benches and stowing targets. He was about to lock up when headlights pierced the downpour. A black SUV rolled slowly to a stop by the clubhouse. The driver's door opened, and Commander Hayes stepped out, her presence unmistakable even in the storm. She looked older than Frank remembered, the fine lines around her eyes deeper, her posture even more deliberate. But when she pulled down her hood, there was the same calm intensity. "Frank," she greeted softly, almost as if she'd never left. "I figured you'd show up again sooner or later," he replied, his voice warm despite the cold rain. He ushered her inside. Lightning flashed outside the window as she handed him a sealed envelope marked with the Naval Special Warfare insignia. "This place has proven invaluable," she explained. "You've helped keep the right people safe, and sometimes the wrong people guessing." Frank accepted the envelope, understanding it wasn't just a token of thanks. It was a sign he was part of something bigger now. He asked, "How bad is it this time?" She hesitated, glancing out the window at the dark tree line. "It's getting worse," she admitted quietly. Domestic groups, international funding, plans that make Silent Harbor look like a warm-up. A knock interrupted them. Agent Wells stepped in, rain dripping from his coat. "Commander," he said with a respectful nod before turning to Frank. "We need to use the range for another 48 hours. We'll pay double the standard rate." Frank waved a hand dismissively. "Money's not what matters. You know that by now." The three of them stood in the small office, the storm howling around them. It felt like a reunion of old friends, except their friendship was forged in shadows, their trust earned through shared secrets. Wells unrolled a map on the table, red circles marking potential threat sites along the coast. "We're forming a joint task force," he explained. "Military and local law enforcement, working together without stepping on each other's toes." Hayes pointed to one of the circles. "They'll test us here first," she said with quiet certainty. "We can't let them." Frank watched them both, realizing how much had changed since he'd first seen Hayes shoot a bullseye no one else believed possible. She'd become the catalyst for an entire system, a network of watchers, protectors, and silent guardians. And he, a retired sailor with a sleepy shooting range, was a part of it. The storm outside began to ease, the wind settling to a steady whisper. Commander Hayes stepped back, her eyes on Frank. "Thank you for keeping this place ready," she said. He smiled faintly, saluting her with a nod. "Thank you for making sure what I do here still matters." As they prepared to leave, the dawn began to break through the clouds, soft light spilling across the rain-soaked range. For the first time in weeks, Frank felt hope, because he knew, no matter what storm was coming, some of them were always around. The morning sun crept higher over the Atlantic, illuminating the empty lanes of Coastal Harbor shooting range. Frank poured himself a cup of black coffee, steam curling in the chilly air. He stepped outside, breathing in the scent of wet earth and salt carried on the breeze. The range was quiet again, but it no longer felt like an ordinary place. It was a waypoint, a safe harbor for those who carried the nation's heaviest burdens. He thought of Commander Hayes, of the subtle strength in her voice, the quiet steel in her eyes. He thought of Agent Wells, of the man who once arrested her and now worked beside her to protect what most would never see. And he thought of the dozens of nameless men and women who would come here, blend in, practice their craft, and disappear again. Silent sentinels who kept the darkness at bay. The world might never know their names, but Frank would remember every one of their stories. Because in those stories were reminders of sacrifice, of courage, of the thin line standing between chaos and peace. And as long as he kept the lights on at Coastal Harbor, they'd always have a place to prepare, to heal, to stay sharp. He took a sip of his coffee, smiling as the first rays of sunlight danced across the shooting lanes. Somewhere out there, Commander Hayes was already moving to her next mission. And Frank knew he'd be here when she, or someone like her, needed him again. Because some of them are always around. You just don't see them, unless you know how to look. In the end, the story of Commander Hayes reminds us that real heroes don't always wear capes, or even uniforms you recognize. Sometimes, they walk among us in silence, carrying responsibilities too heavy to speak about, protecting lives in ways we may never know. Their sacrifices go unseen, their victories uncelebrated, but their presence keeps the darkness at bay. And often, the difference between safety and chaos isn't the headlines we read, but the quiet actions of those who stay hidden, so the rest of us can live without fear. It's a humbling reminder of the thin line between peace and peril, and how important it is to appreciate the unseen work happening every day in the shadows. We owe our security not just to those who serve openly, but also to those who operate in silence, who endure suspicion, hardship, and even personal danger to complete their missions. They are proof that true strength often hides behind an unremarkable face, and real courage is measured not by recognition, but by quiet perseverance. If this story opened your eyes to the hidden sacrifices made by those who serve in silence, don't forget to hit the like button. It helps more people find these untold stories. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next extraordinary tale. And tell me in the comments, do you believe there are heroes living among us, blending in with ordinary life? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences.